content area that we've been in this entire time, right? This whole semester, well, whole year, we've gone all the way from pre-America, right, with the Native American tribes, through the colonies, westward expansion, and the Civil War. So we've covered a lot of ground. Today we're going to be kind of looking ahead into the future, into what you guys will be able to look at more next year, and then we'll be talking about our project that we'll do to end out the year tomorrow. But the question that I had, that I wanted to ask you guys, and you're due now, was in what ways are people still affected by the events of the Civil War today? It's a good skill in history, right? To be able to make connections between the past and the present and see how the past affected and changed things to get to where we are now. So, who has an answer that they'd like to share? And then I'll call some people randomly as well. John.
I think that, just an all-around problem is still discrimination.
Okay.
African American ones that we still face.
Yeah.
There's still a problem that before the Civil War, so I think it was amplified a lot after the Civil War with the introduction of like racial discrimination groups and the KKK. I think it was amplified a lot after the Civil War happened, so there was a lot more. There was a peak of racism after the Civil War and during the Civil War.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's a great point, John, for sure. Yeah, we'll see in what we're learning today that a lot of the things that ended up happening to African American people, the restriction of their rights, was a response to their freedom. And the people mainly in the American South, but even throughout, that wanted to keep them in that kind of subservient place, right? Good. Crew, and then Blake.
Another effect is like slaves, but in more a positive way. Like people start and they're not enslaved anymore. So.
Yeah, that's definitely a positive, right? Effect of the war is, even though it took a long time to get African Americans full rights, right, for them to fight for that and to eventually gain that, they were free still, right? And they did have the ability to, enact some of those rights, right? Eventually to fight for their freedoms. Great, that's awesome. Great. Like what were you gonna say?
That was mine as well. Except the only difference I said was in former Confederate states, because that was a result of the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendments. It was after the Civil War.
Correct.
Slaves in the Confederate states got their freedom during. So.
Yeah. Right. Good point. That is true. Good. Okay. Any other thoughts? So I'm going to call on a couple people if you guys don't want to volunteer. You're fine.
I have 9 in the I have 6 in the Oh, and the periods.
Oh, that's an interesting answer. Benjamin, can you share what you said?
Yeah. So, you said that what ways are people still affected by the events of the Civil War? And I kind of did on the unfortunate side because some people still have you can't change the way we push things, and no one will ever will. But because I know there are still not there are racially motivated groups and most things we say, not most things we say, but around the world today.
Yeah.
The KKK is one of them. That's still active. And,
Yeah.
but since the Civil War happened, people are still confident. I think it's a good cause. It's unfortunate they get to.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, you're right, Benjamin. So even though the war was fought, ultimately it still didn't change everyone's minds, right? Like you said, people's minds aren't going to be changed, in an instant or even over a long time. And there are still groups like that. Yeah, good point. Okay. So a couple more. It's good. Yeah, a lot of you guys said similar things about slavery ending and then the effects that there's still discrimination and stuff like that. So that's good. You guys definitely hit the nail on the head there. And we're definitely far enough removed now from it, but you can imagine even that the advancements in the South technologically, economically, stuff like that are also going to be slowed down for a good amount of time, right? Now that might not have clear effects today, but it also is hard to know for sure, right? There's stuff definitely could still be aftershock in some ways, even all the way back from there. So, okay, good guys. Alright, so what we're going to do next is we're going to kind of look through what happened in specifically the American South after the Civil War. And you guys will probably end up covering some of this stuff next year, so we're not going to get into it too much. Guys, let's not be distracted on our computers, okay? But it's still really good to think about, and it definitely shows you guys the immediate after effects of the war, specifically for African American people. So let me go ahead and pull this up, and we're going to do an activity afterwards that you guys will be able to look at something specifically here. Okay. Main thing I ask of you guys in this, just like anything in history, and especially events that are tragic or brutal or difficult, make sure you guys treat this content respectfully, right? Ask questions, be engaged with it, but it's not good to make light of it, right? So let's make sure we don't do that. Okay. So what we're going to be looking at today is the Jim Crow laws and the effects of those things on African Americans after Reconstruction. So here we go. So, there was a group of people, they called themselves the Redeemers. They were Southern Democrats, and they were committed to the restoration of white elite power, basically, in the South, right? So they were trying to make sure that even though the slaves were freed, that white people would still be in power and in control in the South. And even though we're going to look at these 3 amendments, they did really important things in favor of African American people, the efforts of these people in the South unfortunately ended up stripping away most of those rights, even though they were in law. So the 13th Amendment, as we talked about, ended slavery. The 14th Amendment made African American citizens and said that their rights can't be taken away. And then the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. But we're going to look at how, one by one, each of these amendments was dismantled and basically made to not actually do anything for these people for about 100 years after the war. Eventually, they were able to get those rights. So let's look first at the 13th Amendment. So as we said, it ended slavery, but there were a few different things that people used to keep slaves tied to the land. So one was called sharecropping. So basically in sharecropping, the Southern farm owners who previously had a lot of slaves would hire those slaves back to work on that land. They would pay them very little, and it made it so that those people basically continued to work for the same owners that they used to, and their lives didn't improve very much, even though they were now free. So even though slavery was over, they were now what you would probably consider modern day wage slavery, which means that they're being paid so little that it's not very much different than actual slavery, which does happen today, unfortunately, in some places. So, another one is debt bondage. So this is another thing. Because African American people, when they were freed, basically had no money, they had no possessions, they had no land, no property, then they went into debt very quickly. And because of that, they were allowed to be forced into forced labor in order to pay off their debts. So again, we see that even though slavery was ended by the amendment, in actuality, these people were still suffering under things that were very similar to slavery right afterwards. And then we have the convict lease system. Basically, this is anyone who is African American who is arrested and charged with crimes and imprisoned could be allowed to work for free as well. That was in the 13th Amendment, that slavery is illegal except in the case of a punishment for a crime. So even though African American people, again, were not slaves by law, they could still be convicted of convicted of a crime and forced to work as slaves if they were prisoners. And as you would imagine, the legal system, especially for these people, since many of them in the South especially they were all viewed as lesser people, they got arrested and put in prison for things that were oftentimes very unfair or even made up. And you guys will see that next year when you guys look at the book To Kill a Mockingbird, which is about that, about a legal case where an African American man is going to be sent to prison for something he didn't do and ended up getting defended by a lawyer. But it's a very interesting story. Yeah, sorry.
I've already read the back. I'll forget.
Okay, next we you have the 14th Amendment, right? And this is the amendment that African Americans are now citizens, and by law, right, citizens should have full legal rights, right? They should be able to do anything they want to in the public sphere, so long as it's not hurting anyone, right? As long as they're not breaking any laws. They should have equal access to anything. But unfortunately, we see the implementation of the Jim Crow laws. So basically what that did, we talked about this briefly, but it segregated African Americans in all public places from white people. So public places, vehicles, employment, any of those things, they were kept separate. And as you'd imagine, most of the time the things provided for African American people was significantly less useful or less well maintained or any of those things than those for whites, right? So again, they're not actually getting the same rights. An interesting fact, the origin of the phrase Jim Crow came from what was called Jump Jim Crow, which was a song and dance caricature of black people that were performed by white actors wearing makeup, basically blackface makeup. And so it became an offensive expression for black people, basically. So here is an example of someone who dressed up like that. So there you go. Yeah. That's also why in modern day, right, things like blackface or stuff like that, where you like make yourself look like someone of a different race, specifically black people, is considered offensive because they did that to make fun of them. Yes.
That's why we could do that for a video.
Yes. That's correct. John.
Isn't in some cases that's called cultural appropriation too?
Yeah. Cultural appropriation. That's. Sorry. Go ahead.
Which that's highly offensive to not most but all races.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. For sure. And yeah, we talked about that actually in my other class, my ancient world history class, about the difference between respecting other cultures and appropriating, right? So if you appropriation oftentimes is when you take something from that culture and either make fun of it or don't represent it well, or if it's something, especially if it has significant meaning to that culture, and you just, you know, if it's clothing or if it's a tradition of some kind and you just do it for fun, but it actually has an importance to them, then that would be like an appropriation, right? Where you're being disrespectful to that culture. Good. Good questions, guys. So like we said, the laws ended up becoming known as Jim Crow laws because they were, again, intentionally meant for restricting the rights of African American people. And all sorts of different things became segregated. Like we said, all things in the public space, and even things, here's another example. This is a dispenser for Coca-Cola, and it says white customers only. So even things like that, you could be restricted if you were black from purchasing items and from all those things. Yeah. Yeah, there was oftentimes like colored water fountains and white water fountains where they were only allowed to go to different things.
Man, I wish stuff was 6 cents now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. That's how inflation goes.
You can get a burger for like 50 cents.
Less than that. This is probably from like the early 1900s. Yeah.
The Great Depression.
It was like $1.
No, I don't know the exact like
No, that's
transfer.
gotta be like $52.
Yeah. And so again, guys, it's important to note that all these African American people were just freed. So some of them started businesses, right? They started to try to get into trades like carpentry or being barbers or even restaurant owners, any of those things. With Jim Crow, white people would just never go to those places, right? They would only go to white-owned businesses and stuff like that. And then black people ended up not being able to access any of those other services too. Yeah, John.
Was this only for African Americans or different Native American tribes too?
At this point, it was mostly directed towards African American people. There weren't in the South as many Native American tribes left there, unfortunately. Many of them have been pushed out in westward expansion. So, yeah, no, there were really bad things happening to Native American people going throughout the 1800s and early 1900s.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think I said this, but don't that fire alarm that happens around 12 every day, that actually Fallon was actually what's known as a sundown town. A sundown town is known as I actually live on the reservation, a small reservation. So when all the other Americans were pushed out to fill out a reservation, they were allowed to come back into Fallon to get whatever they needed, like go to their job or get grocery shopping or whatever they needed. And as soon as that alarm sounded at 12 every day, they would be forced by law to go back to the reservation. It's known as a sundown town, and there's actually that's not what I mean. It's not a prominent effect now,
Right.
but that's what that alarm used to mean.
Yeah. That's interesting, right? Tyler?
So I get more than down. This is if you remember student size that would say no blacks out after 6 p.m.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's crazy how prevalent it was for a really long time. And honestly, it wasn't even, it wasn't that long ago, right, that these things changed.
Yeah, like
It's
80s,
60s, like late 60s, that the Civil Rights Act was passed. Yeah. Right. No, you're right. So I guess what I mean is the actual laws were passed in the 60s, but many of those treatments didn't stop and for much longer. Yeah. No, you're right for sure. So yeah, crazy and not good and unfortunate in our history, but it's important to be aware of it. Okay. Here's some examples. So again, this is talking about Jim Crow laws. Segregated blacks from whites in public places, vehicles, or employment. Here are some examples of signs from the time. And you can see here, there are other races included sometimes. This talks about Mexican people as well, unfortunately.
No dog, nephew.
Yep. And you can see here, guys, with me. Okay. Again, this is like dehumanizing, right? The goal for them is to dehumanize these people to make it okay, they feel okay about doing this, right? So even putting dogs on the same list as these other human beings. It sounds like crazy, but yeah, that is actually something that would definitely happen. So in 1883, there were a bunch of civil rights cases. This one was really important. So the Supreme Court declared that the 14th Amendment only protected citizens from the government's infringement of their rights, not private infringement. Basically what that means is they said the government can't infringe on colored people's rights, but private citizens can. So that's what the government decided back in the 1880s. And then we have a landmark case, Plessy versus Ferguson. We're going to look at that in more detail in our activity. But this was in 1896, and it decided that racial segregation was constitutional. And it established what they called the doctrine of separate but equal. So they said that it was legal to separate races as long as you provided equal things for them. Again, it's important to note that oftentimes it wasn't actually equal, and even just separating people in general creates inequality just based off of the separation. In which later on they'll end up overturning that decision in Brown versus Board of Education in the 60s, which opened the door for the Civil Rights Act. Yes.
Like, even though they say it's equal, like, a lot of the things that the white people got was a lot better, or, like, for instance, like the buses, even though, they were separated, the blacks still sit when they didn't want to.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, no, they didn't have freedom of choice by any means. And, I mean, it's very clear that all of these laws were not meant to actually help black people in any way. Even though the language says, well, they're equal still. That isn't actually what really happened, right? So yeah, again, this is really important because these cases basically, again, show that segregation is going to be allowed and it's going to continue until something changes, right? So this is the way it was. All right. Next, we're going to look at the 15th Amendment, which gave African Americans the right to vote. And you'd think that that would be the way that they'd be able to try to combat some of this, right? If they could vote different people into office, if they could try to vote for different laws, they'd be able to protect themselves and try to get more equality, right? But even though they had the right to vote, various different laws were passed that restricted them and kept them from actually voting. So one example is literacy tests. As you guys know, slaves were not educated, so they were freed, but they couldn't read or write, many of them. So passing a literacy test was something that only white people could do oftentimes. And even when black people were becoming educated and becoming more skilled in all those things and trying to recover from the harms of slavery, they made the literacy tests almost unpassable for black people. So they would do things like intentionally have trick questions, intentionally make it so that you had to have answers ahead of time, stuff like that. So they basically gamed the system. They also did poll taxes, so you had to pay in order to vote, which again is restrictive for these African American people who were kept in poverty by those laws already, by segregation, and through the lack of jobs that they were able to get. Property requirements, that's another one. So some states passed laws where you had to own property. Again, you can see how this would restrict struggling African American people. Grandfather clauses. So that one is basically you had to have family members who were citizens in order to vote. So if you were a brand new citizen, African American person, then obviously you wouldn't have that, so you wouldn't be able to vote there. And then they even had some things as obvious as all white primaries where they would have primary elections, which is where you choose who's going to run for office before you actually all vote on it. And they had those restricted to only whites. So all of those things you guys can see are extremely restrictive and kept African American people from voting, unfortunately. Yeah. Yeah, Barack Obama was the first black president, that is true. Yep. Obama.
Osama bin Laden.
No.
Oh, leave us. Let's not get jokes.
No.
That
Alright.
that is not
There's a line. There's a very
That's
fine.
not
And one more thing to note here, guys, that's important to look at, is even if somehow African American people got through almost, all these various different hurdles, there was also just the threat of violence. Because again, the KKK or even people not affiliated with them were very open and felt very free to enact violence on black people during this time. And being beaten up or even lynched, stuff like that was pretty common for black people who tried to, step out of line. Guys, what are we doing? Make sure you're paying attention. Okay. And here is a warning here, but this is a picture, a photograph of some African American people who have been lynched.
is lynching like hanging?
Hanging, yeah. And you guys can see that, unfortunately, the people, there's many people involved here. It wasn't something that just a few people were involved in. Many people were active in doing things like this. And this is basically anyone who stepped out of line of the Jim Crow laws, who did anything that could have been perceived as a slight towards white people, who did anything that would, maybe sometimes it was even nothing, right? There were plenty of cases where just because white people at this point in time, right, really didn't like black people or didn't want them to have any freedom of rights or ability to do things for themselves, they could easily make up things all the time to do stuff like this. And it wasn't just lynchings, they would also torture. Sometimes they would burn black people at the stake, or just murder with any other method. And from 1882 to 1968, there were 3,446 black lynchings in the United States. So a significant number of people. Yeah, John.
So I know that the most known violent group was KKK, but were there any other ones that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know for sure. There were a lot of various different people and groups, and sometimes it wasn't even just a group. It was just, hey, let's just go do this sort of thing. Like
The only other one that I can really think of is
guys, listen.
today there are these things called neo-Confederate groups. They still salute like the Confederate battle flag. They're white supremacists.
Yeah.
I'd imagine a couple decades after the Civil War, you would start to see these groups of people emerge, and there might have been violence back in the day.
Oh, for sure. there was definitely a lot of still like pro-Confederate sentiment in the South for a long time, and clearly there still is in some pockets. Yeah, crew.
When people would do this, would no one would get arrested or anything?
No, unfortunately, oftentimes the law enforcement was either in on it or just looked the other way. Yeah.
That's
Yep. And we're not going to show all of them, but just so you know, the body of evidence is pretty wide. There's hundreds of photos of African Americans who've been burned, decapitated, hung, all of those things. Yeah. We'll move on.
Even if I didn't care if this happened to black people, I still wouldn't show up. Those people look like they're having a great time at that lynching.
Yeah.
They're so happy that it's happening.
Like I was smiling.
Yeah, it was definitely a twisted way of thinking. Yeah.
That's horrible.
Yeah.
Well, that's America.
So, something really important with all these things is that when we study history, especially the history of people who are oppressed in this way, guys, make sure you're listening, paying attention, not being distracted. It's really important to recognize those people and their humanity, and also that they were not just victims, right? They also fought back and worked hard, right, to try to get rights and try to stop these injustices from happening, right? So one example is Booker T. Washington. He was an advocate for African Americans and African American rights. He was actually born into slavery as a child, and basically he was freed when the 13th Amendment passed. Initially, he tried to get an education, but he didn't have any money, and then eventually he was able to continue fighting for himself to get an education at a college, at the Hampton Institution is what it was called, and basically he hampered his way into and worked his way to have enough money and for the people there to accept him enough for him to actually be educated there. So he does end up getting an education, and then he ends up starting a school called the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which was a university that accepted African American students. So it was a big step for rights for black people. Now, he was interesting because he took a bit of a more conservative approach to trying to get civil rights for black people. He didn't believe that the best way was to go all out protest and revolt at that point, because he believed that it would be too much pushback from white people to actually work. So he argued that black people should get skills, vocational skills, job skills, and should work hard, prove their value, and eventually racism would fade, was what he believed. Now, not everyone agreed with him, especially black people who were actively suffering violence constantly. This wasn't something that they were willing to do, which makes sense. So that was one side. Another side was a man named W.E.B. Du Bois, who argued for much quicker action to try to end civil rights. So there was kind of a few different sides on how to approach it. But these are a couple examples. So here's Du Bois. So he was a bit of the new generation of people advocating for African American rights. He didn't come from slavery like Washington did, but he actually came from middle class. His parents managed to get decent jobs, and he was raised in a decent environment. But despite that, he still was extremely active and passionate about helping African American people and trying to gain rights for them quickly. So he argued that people should be proactive in getting rights. And his roots allowed him to get a college education, and then went on to be the first African American graduate from Harvard. All of those things allowed him to write many different books advocating for civil rights. And he said specifically that black people are Americans, which again was not something that was widely believed at the time because they were brought over as slaves. Many people argued that black people were, again, separate, that they didn't deserve the same rights as Americans, all those things. He definitely argued the opposite, that they were Americans too. They lived here as long as anyone else had, and they deserved the equal treatment, right? Go ahead.
A little bit off topic, but
Yeah.
how old is Harvard?
as he's looking that up, I'll continue. So Du Bois founded the Niagara Movement, which was a black civil rights organization that was founded in 1905. And then he founded the NAACP, which was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which again was pushing for full civil rights for African Americans. And these things ended up being very influential as time went on, and including in the Civil Rights Act too. Yeah, White.
So Harvard is 386 years old.
How old, sir?
386 years old.
Well, there you go.
386 years old.
Unfortunately, guys, like we said, these rights took a long, long time to eventually be gained. And even him, who was as active as anyone in trying to get them, who was active from, the 1880s through the 1960s, he ended up becoming disillusioned, and in his older age, ended up renouncing his U.S. citizenship and moving to Africa before he eventually died. Now, funny enough, he ended up dying only a few years before the Civil Rights Act was passed. But again, like we've said, like Benjamin pointed out, and you're due now, even despite the Civil Rights Act and those rights officially being given to African American people, it didn't, and Tyler, you mentioned even too, with Fallon and stuff like that, right? The treatment of those people didn't change overnight, right? It's not like, boom, now everyone's treated equally. Those things take time. So it's important, right, for us to make sure we think about those things and to reflect on the past, and think about how, we can help anybody out, anyone who we can see is being treated wrongly, stuff like that, for sure. Okay, good. Last thing we're going to do here is we're going to watch a short video.
What would also prove elusive for America's 9 million blacks. Black men could vote in theory, but in fact most were barred by white intimidation, poll taxes, and literacy tests. 85% of black Americans lived in poverty in the southern United States, segregated from whites by so-called Jim Crow laws, laws upheld by the Supreme Court that all but wiped out the freedom and equality once promised by emancipation.
It is the complete denial of the American dream. They cannot go to the same schools with whites. They can't drink in the same drinking fountains. They cannot sit in the same part of a streetcar or in the same cars on a railroad. It's a horrible time. White politicians compete with each other in the South for being more, at least verbally, violent toward African Americans, and in many cases are encouraging or at least abetting actual violence.
They were lynching blacks so hard that a week that 2 or 3 blacks didn't get lynched or burned at the stake. I don't know whether you heard that or not. You ever hear of any black people being burned at the stake? Well, that's what happened. I never lived in those days.
The most prominent black leader at the turn of the century, Booker T. Washington, accepted the notion of separateness. He asked blacks to better themselves through work and vocational training. From whites, he asked for help, not equality.
Booker T. Washington was born a slave, called his autobiography Up From Slavery. This is a man who has pulled himself up by his own bootstraps. And he takes the perspective that it would be foolish to challenge what's being done to them too soon and too openly.
But there would be a challenge. In 1905, the black intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois urged a new struggle for full political and social equality. Entrenched resistance to such change would make civil rights, as Du Bois predicted, the major social issue in American life for the rest of the century.
So that was a good summary of what we just talked about. What? Oh, yeah. No, that kind of give you an example of how many people were involved with things like that. There enormous numbers of people who were very actively against civil rights. Okay, one little question for you guys before we get to our activity. So, imagine you're living in this time, right? And you're trying to decide if you were trying to help get civil rights for these people. Would you be more on the side of Washington and try to go for like a slow, measured approach where, they slowly kind of gain skills and jobs and stuff like that? Or would you be more on the side of Du Bois, who was active for, much more arguing for protests and active fights in legislature and much more quick change? So think about it for a second, and then let me see what you guys think. Okay, you can go ahead and talk your tables for 30 seconds. What do you think?
I would say that, like, when you're doing the videos, that's okay. What? Video.
Ignore everyone.
Worst can appreciate
So I feel like if you go too fast, that will just make it yeah. And then
Okay, guys, back with me in 3, 2, and 1. Okay, let's hear some thoughts. So again, are you more on the side of Booker T. Washington, slow, careful approach, or on the side of Du Bois, which is, let's get this done. No matter what we need to do, we're going to try to end this and get equal rights more quickly. Wyatt, go ahead.
I would say Washington approach because I feel like if you go with what's the other dude?
Du Bois.
I feel like that would just make it to where like the racist groups are more threatening to the protesters.
Right. Okay. I see what you're saying there. Elaine, go ahead.
I would also like to go with Washington.
Okay.
Because when you're outside, it's slowly getting dark. You barely even notice. But then, like, say you're outside playing, and then you go inside and get ready for bed or whatever. Then you go back outside and it's dark. Like, it happens so suddenly.
Okay.
So it's better to go smoothly because then you barely even notice and it becomes the new normal, I guess.
Okay. Interesting. I see what you're saying there. Tyler, what do you think, buddy? I'm gonna go to you, John.
I would go for Washington because I feel like the boys of men kind of have more conflict
Okay.
against the blacks, and Washington is more like a slower approach. Like instead of trying to gain colony, he's just trying to like get help.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, that makes sense. Hey guys, let's not be distracted with whatever you're doing there. Make sure you're looking and listening to whoever's talking. Okay, John, go ahead.
I like to mostly agree with Elaine's statement and her kind of like observation with the gradual change. I think going Washington's side would lead to more likely of a chance and less lives being threatened, as the recent people might not notice much of happening. But it's a slowly gradual change that could lead to more lives being saved.
Okay. Blake, what do you think?
To add on to John, I also believe in Washington's approach, but not because it's slow and gradual change, so much as because it goes for African Americans gaining the respect of white people. If both sides learn to accept each other, that would be best, and the process being slow is simply a side effect of both sides gaining respect for each other.
Okay.
I feel
Interesting.
like that would be the best
Yeah.
solution.
Does anyone favor more of Du Bois' side on this? It's interesting. devil's advocate here and argue the other side. I'm not necessarily taking a side here, but it's important to think about both sides, right? So I can totally see what you guys are saying, right? And many people did support Washington, Booker T. Washington and what he was trying to accomplish. The people who didn't would argue that even if the African Americans in this time were not actively, a lot of them were not actively fighting for their rights, and they were still getting lynched and getting a ton of violence against them, even though they were just trying to work and make lives for themselves. So they definitely have a case in this, in this kind of argument saying like, yeah, we could keep going slow and steady, but we're still getting murdered every step of the way. So at some point, maybe we just need to go all out and fight back. And even though there might be more lives lost initially, it will result, right, in a better outcome later on. It's interesting to see too, historically, both ways kind of end up being used in some ways because it took a long time, right? It took all the way through the 60s. So you could say that Washington's method of taking a long time might have helped it eventually. But when you guys look at the civil rights movement in the 60s, it was a struggle. It was violent and it was tough. And from the black perspective, right, they were peacefully protesting in most cases. There were some groups that were more politically violent, but most of the violence was enacted on black people at the time. But they had to march, they had to protest, they had to actively engage in fighting against and trying to fight for their rights, right? So it ended up kind of being both, right? In the end, both methods ended up being used to a point. Yeah.
Alright, well, I'd like to hop in and also say, no one said that change is easy.
True.
Almost every time in history, the slow way out was never taken.
Mm-hmm.
And when the fast route was taken, for instance, the Russian Civil War, over 10 million people died.
It's true.
And it was a very short period of time, like 1 year.
Yeah.
And then the same for the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
It was rapid change over a long period of time.
Right.
Still faster than African Americans getting rights.
Yeah.
And over 650,000 people died.
Right.
So.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, no, it's an interesting point for sure. Elaine.
I also think that if African Americans were to fight, like not protesting, which that's what I think. It would make the white people think more like, oh, they really are as bad as we thought. And that would also slow down.
Yeah, that is the doctrine that Martin Luther King Jr. In the civil rights movement advocated for, was for peaceful protest, right? That no matter what, we can't stoop to the level of violence, and we have to try to, protest peacefully and confidently and determinedly, right? But basically, and he was right. I mean, in a lot of ways, guys, one of the major issues and one of the reasons why the civil rights movement didn't take off sooner is because many people just didn't know how bad it was. And oftentimes in the North. Now, some did and didn't do anything. Many did and didn't do anything. But it's different, especially because it was the era of television, so people had televisions, and many of the protests ended up being broadcasted. And newspapers would show images and stuff like that too, and radio shows would show, talk about it. So a lot of the violence that was being done to African Americans in those protests and in those moments was widely spread to everybody, right? So everyone knew about it, and it really helped that movement succeed ultimately. Yeah.
I think the same thing about the newspapers and the TV and the radio broadcasting those. I think they might have purposely pictured the worst parts of those protests to make the people think, oh yeah, these people are as bad as we thought. Because they can purposely take pictures of the worst parts.
You might have misunderstood potentially. What are you saying? I'm sorry. Clarify.
So when for a newspaper that you take pictures and then maybe mostly the whole part of the protest was peaceful, but then maybe some people acted out, and then they could have just taken pictures of those bad parts and purposely made the black people seem like bad people.
Right. Yes, they could have. Thankfully, though, in the protests, especially the ones organized by Martin Luther King Jr. and by that organization, were very committed to being peaceful. And so a lot of the things I'm talking about, and hopefully your teacher next year shows you some of these videos and images and stuff. But for example, there were a lot of protests in Alabama where huge amounts of black people would march on whatever state capitol building or city capitol building, and they would just stand and protest and yell and all those things. And it was the violence enacted against them that I was talking about. Like white people, it's like one example, they use fire trucks that basically have water blasts powerful enough to put out house fires, and they would spray down the crowds, and people would go flying down the streets. Like, anyway, that's some of the examples. In some places there was just straight up murder happening. Yeah. So anyway, but yeah, you're right. They could have. Thankfully, they didn't. But. Oh yeah. Fire hoses can knock you down.
Yeah, it takes a couple of times to hold the thing.
Yeah.
Like building.
They either have to be mounted on the truck, or if you're holding them by hand, it takes at least a couple of firemen to hold on to it.
I was on the front bench stage.
Yeah.
Two guys behind him actually hold the hose.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really powerful. Anyway, okay, good guys. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and transition us into an activity
Take a nap.
that we're going to look at.
Take a nap.
Yeah, I know you guys are tired.
I don't want to spend
Okay, here's what I want you guys to do. Everybody has on me? Okay, for 1 minute while I do this, I want you guys to stand up, walk around the room, talk to each other, get your energy out.
One guy, I want you to stand still. Took a fire hose to the body with a shield. A homemade one at that point. One after part.
Well, water, for instance, so, in aircraft carriers, how jets slow down so fast is they basically put huge middlewares.
Yep.
Those have, we're not going. And that is the worst case scenario.
You're gonna die. But
And that is like, okay, so we're going to release this no, basically, wires back, educating people, and they have to at least that I know from I don't think so.
It's one of these guys.
But it's like,
no.
I didn't